It's my pleasure to introduce you to Stephen Heyman, who has written this fabulous book. I just finished reading it and I can't stop thinking about it. The Planter of Modern Life, Louis Bromfield and the Seeds of a Food Revolution. So Stephen is talking to us from Pittsburgh, and Stephen, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
First, I want to ask you about how you're doing in coronavirus. I know, congratulations, you have a new son, and a little bit about your writing background.
Oh, sure. Yeah, my wife gave birth to our first child, Max, April 25th, and I'm completely exhausted. And I guess in a way, there are probably worse times to have a baby since we'd be home anyways. But we're fine. We're adapting like everyone else, and Max has become something of a star on FaceTime with my family, all of whom are very sad they can't meet him. But we're muddling through. And it's obviously an unusual time to be launching a book, but I've been heartened by the reaction so far. And of course, I'm thrilled to be here with you. And then in terms of my background, I'm a freelance writer. I write for different magazines and newspapers. I used to be on staff at the New York Times. I was an editor at the Style magazine there. And I discovered this book while working on a travel story in southwestern Pennsylvania. I happened to meet a lamb farmer who, he's in his 60s now. His name is John Jameson, and he's kind of one of the early adopters of sustainable agriculture. He and his wife, Suki, got started selling their pastured lamb in the New Yorker magazine by mail order. They would print these one-page advertisements. And they were both English majors and really charming people. And I was curious about how they decided to become farmers. And John told me that one of the reasons was by reading this guy, Louis Bromfield's books. I had never heard of him. And I thought that I was like somewhat familiar with the heroes of the, organic movement and early environmentalism, but his name didn't really ring a bell. I got home and I started doing a little bit of research, and I discovered that not only was he one of the earliest proponents of organic farming in America, but he had this incredible earlier life as a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, and that he lived in Paris between the wars and was a really close friend of Gertrude Stein and Edith Wharton, and had a famous garden where he entertained lots of writers and movie stars and all sorts of people. And I became immediately seduced by this strange story of the novelist who became America's most famous farmer.
You write so beautifully, and the story really comes to life, and you get to know Louis, but also his family. And how did you go about the research? Particularly intrigued, did you meet his daughter, Ellen? Was she still living when you were started this?
Yes. So Bromfield had 3 daughters, and the youngest, Ellen, was still alive. She died in October of 2019. It was very sad that she didn't get a chance to read the book. But she and her husband, Carson, who's also a character in the book, were very open. I visited them. They came to Bromfield's farm, Malabar, which is as much of a character in the book as a lot of other significant people. His farm, which is in Richland County, Ohio. Anyways, I met Ellen there, and then I flew down to Brazil, where she's lived for the past 40 or 50 years. And I interviewed them for a long time. And she had also written a lot about her dad, including a memoir called The Heritage, which was a great source for me. So yeah, that's a gift for a biographer to have such a close living relative.
Is the house still standing? You said it's now a park, Malabar?
Yeah, so Malabar Farm is now an Ohio State Park. It's near the city of Mansfield. Bromfield had built a 19-room Greek Revival farmhouse that he called the Big House, and it's perfectly preserved. This is the place where Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall got married in 1945. And they were just some of the movie stars that visited the farm. He so people from around there go to Malabar often, and there are beautiful nature trails. They still do raise some crops, which are planted along brownfield's original contours. And people go mushroom hunting, and they make maple syrup. It's a really wonderful kind of rural destination. Although it's probably more famous today for being the setting of some scenes from the film Shawshank Redemption than as being Louis Bromfield's home. He, despite his great fame in his lifetime, has kind of vanished from popular memory. And so part of the ambition of this book is to kind of dust him off a bit.
He was so ahead of his time in terms of his farming ideas and his principles that he felt so strongly about. His 30 years ahead on DDT, really incredible. And the way to farm the land. Do you think it was, did he get these ideas at Cornell, or how, some influence from his father? Like, talk maybe a little bit about how he got inspired by this, and then went this whole other route to become this literary giant.
Yeah. So, you know, he grew up kind of with one foot on his grandfather's farm. He grew up in the town of Mansfield, Ohio, and he loved everything about the farming lifestyle. But at the time, the life of the kind of small, diversified farmer was dying out. This would be, you know, in the first decades of the 20th century. And he eventually chose a literary path and became very successful as a novelist. And once he became sufficiently successful, he moved to Paris, which was the thing to do in 1925. But then shortly thereafter, he moves outside of the city of Paris to this town called Senlis, which is north of the city, about 30 miles. And he begins to lay out a beautiful garden. And he is very influenced by the kind of frugality of the French peasant gardeners that were his neighbors, basically. The way they kind of cherished the land, the way they composted, and he was really impressed by how he and his neighbors were cultivating land that had been under constant cultivation for the past 10 centuries. And it was more fertile than ever before. And he was saying to himself, why is this the case while in the Midwestern United States, this was in the 1930s, you know, you were seeing bad farming practices culminate in widespread soil erosion and the Dust Bowl and things like that. And so these ideas are kind of swirling in his head. He writes this agrarian novel, which is kind of an autobiography, called The Farm in 1933. It becomes a very big bestseller. And then he goes to India. And this is kind of the origin of the name Malabar. And he connects with a guy named Albert Howard, who is kind of the founding father of the organic movement. And to make a very long story short, his experience discovering organic farming in India, his experience gardening in France, they transform his relationship with the land. By the time he moves back to America in 1938, he has the ambition that he wants to farm, that he wants to raise his children on an honest-to-God farm. He's disgusted with the direction of the world. You know, he was very politically active and kind of prescient about a lot of the terrible events that occurred in the 1930s and 40s. And he basically devotes himself to agriculture, and then the rest of his life is spent trying to argue and advocate and fight for a better way of farming and a better relationship with the land. And to the extent that he continued his literary career, it kind of bifurcated at that point. He wrote passionately and beautifully about agriculture and the land. And then he wrote potboiler, trashy novels in order to support his farming enterprise. As a result, his literary reputation eroded, even as his agricultural reputation increased.
Well, I couldn't believe I know that's what made the book so compelling, because you do it so well of bringing out both sides of his life. So he became this major success in Hollywood of writing screenplays. It seemed like no matter what he wrote, it still became a bestseller or became a movie. And I was staggered by the prices that he was being paid, which even
Yes.
now sounds like a lot. And then back then, and then that he put this money in the farm and he still went broke, like the cost of farming. And it was amazing. It was interesting, his political activism and his time away from the farm, that
Yeah.
he did Malabar, moved his family, and then basically took off to go tour all over the world. So that,
I mean, there's this great line that James Thurber has about Bromfield. It's like, I've met Louis in London, Paris, Hollywood, New York, and every time he says, have you heard I'm living on a farm in Ohio? He was definitely a man about town, despite the fact that he spent so much time, knee deep in manure.
I thought, when I was reading it, I thought, oh, today he would be like an Instagram influencer of trying to, and then he was marketing everything. And then when he started taking money for, oh, sure, I'll promote your product and this product. But
absolutely. That's what I think makes him so modern. I mean, when we think of like an agrarian writer, we think of someone often like Wendell Berry, who is fantastic, but he, plows his fields with draft horses and doesn't have a computer. There's something kind of atavistic about his whole project. And Bromfield, I think if you were alive today, would be farming with robots and would have 1 million followers on Twitter and a podcast. I mean, he was very much a modern man, for better or worse. And that's what's so extraordinary. See him kind of at a time, living at a time where his contributions weren't really understood.
Right. And then to have this really from modest background in Ohio to hobnobbing with all the world's famous celebrities. So I hope this gives everyone a taste. This book it's for, I think, first of all, if you appreciate great writing and research, but if you have the love of the land, but there's so much more to it. And did you think he was a good writer? I assume that you read The Farm, and how much did you read of his works?
I think that some of his books are excellent and others less so.
And he won the Pulitzer Prize too, which I assume back then was equally as prestigious as it is today. Or no, or
more or less. It was definitely a big deal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was great. All right. Well, I think we're out of time here, but everyone, just so you know, Jonathan over at Talking Leaves does have this book in stock, and you can now you can call the store, place your order, you can do it on the website, and you can just, he'll bring it out to the car. They're doing also curbside pickup or delivery. And so highly recommend The Planter of Modern Life. Stephen, it's a total pleasure meeting you. We wish you all the best with your book. And I hope that in a future time, maybe when it comes out in paperback in a year, we can entice you to come from Pittsburgh. It's an easy drive up to Buffalo. We'd love to meet you.
I'd be delighted. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.